Good evening, everyone. Welcome to week number 4 for MPA 623. I find it kind of hard to believe we're already in week 4. So after tonight's class, we'll be officially halfway through the course, which is kind of shocking to me. I don't know, it might not be shocking to you, but it is to me just how quickly these 8-week courses go by. But we are in week number 4, and I've had a chance to review the Canvas essay number 2. And so I reviewed all of those and I have provided feedback on those. Not a whole lot of feedback because admittedly I've been juggling reviewing those as well as taking a look at the background papers. And so I thought probably more important to provide feedback on the background paper as compared to Canvas essay number 2. So the feedback on number 2 is maybe a little bit slight, but I did provide feedback and provide grades on Canvas essay number 2. Canvas essay number 3 is coming up around the corner. Your next Canvas essay number 3 should not be a whole lot of original work for you, because for Canvas essay number 3, you are simply going to share the issue or the problem that you wrote about in your background paper. So what you'll do is just take what you wrote in your background paper, distill it down into 2 or 3 paragraphs for a posting in your Canvas essay number 3. The whole purpose of that is just so you can share your issue or problem that you are talking about with your colleagues, and they can chime in and perhaps give you a little bit of feedback. You've already received my feedback in the background paper, so I won't provide a whole lot of feedback on Canvas essay number 3, but you'll have that opportunity in that forum to kind of share some information, some insights as a class. So it should be a pretty quick and pretty straightforward one for you. Just distill your background paper into 2 or 3 paragraphs, and you'll be in good shape for Canvas essay number 3. As always, your initial post is due by Saturday, and then response to a classmate will then be due no later than next Monday. So that's Canvas essay number 3. The background papers, I have been diligently working my way through those, and you may have seen you got feedback very quickly. Some of you did, some of you it was several hours. It depends on when your paper came in. I was logged into the Canvas site all last night and was grading papers kind of as they came in. I would read them, provide feedback, and return them. So if you got feedback in 10 or 15 minutes, it meant that your paper was the only one that had come in at that point in time, and I had the opportunity to review it immediately. For those of you who turned your paper in a little bit later in the evening, you may not have gotten feedback until this morning, but I think I have gone through, at this point, I think 38 of the background papers and have reviewed them and provided feedback on those. So I'm through 38 of them. So pretty much accomplished my goal of getting through all of them by class tonight. Again, I didn't go through and line edit each line on a paper. I started doing that, and then I always catch myself and remind myself not to edit papers, and instead kind of look at more holistically, look at the content of the paper. For some of the papers, I did insert some edits and insert some comments in terms of writing style. And so I was trying to be very judicious in terms of the amount of edits I put into the papers. I thought the papers were very good. I think that all the topics that were discussed in all the papers, those topics will work very well for this course. And so no one has to go down a different avenue or find a different topic. I think all the issues and problems that were identified are certainly appropriate for the assignments we're doing. Certainly a lot of commonalities in the problems that were identified, and that's common. I see that every time I do this course. I think the number one problem that was identified across all the or majority of the papers was the problem of employee turnover. And when you have high rates of turnover, what are the implications then, obviously, for effectiveness in terms of training new employees, recruiting to get new employees, onboarding those employees, loss of institutional memory, the impact on succession planning. So there are really a myriad of different types of impacts that high levels of employee turnover can have. And I know a lot of people talked about employee turnover. Let's see what else. Some people talked about communication, collaboration problems in organizations and how that inhibits effectiveness. I'm trying to think of what some of the others were. I know some people talked about the lack of a commitment to DEI and incorporating DEI within an organization. I saw that in a couple of different papers. Short staffing, I saw that. short in terms of funding for the organization. I saw that as well. So again, a lot of commonalities, but I think everyone did a nice job. And so the grades tended to be relatively high. I think they were all in the A category. I don't think we had anything out of the A category. So really the only reason I would have deducted any points was in terms of there are some proofreading issues here and there. You may have missed a couple points because of that. Otherwise, I thought the background papers were all very well done. So now that the background paper is behind you, then it's time to start looking at the next upcoming written assignment, which is the alternative solutions paper. So this alternative solutions paper, as we discussed on our first night in class, this one is due on April 29th, so due in a couple of weeks. So I thought we'd spend a few minutes here at the outset of class tonight to go back through the requirements of the alternative solutions paper and make sure everyone's familiar and comfortable with what we're doing with the alternative solutions paper. So again, this is a brief assignment, so this should not be a dissertation. So this is a very brief assignment. Be as parsimonious and concise as you can possibly be. And you're presenting to me 3 different alternative solutions to the problem, the issue that you identified in your background paper. So as you identify those 3 alternative solutions, I want you for each one of those solutions to identify the alternative solution. What is the solution? And how will it solve the problem or address the issue? What specific steps would be taken in this solution? So just kind of give me a background about an idea of what the solution is. Then actor involvement, give me an idea of who is involved or will be involved in the implementation of that solution. Who would be involved in developing and implementing the solution? What roles would each individual or group play? And how would you get the agreement and the buy-in from each one of these actors? And then finally, in implementation, how easy or difficult would it be to actually implement this solution? And Maria, that's an excellent point you have in text here. I was going to mention that I forgot to, is when you start your alternative solutions paper, if you could just give me a really brief couple sentences, paragraph, just to remind me what the issue or the problem is that you're focusing on before you then present the 3 alternative solutions. So thanks for mentioning that. It would just be a good way that you'll refresh my memory that here's the issue that's being addressed, and then you can launch into your 3 different alternative solutions. As you think about these alternative solutions, I want you to think about them from the perspective of practicality. So I want you to propose solutions that are practical, that you can actually envision being implemented. And so I know for a few folks, you have the idea of, well, here we have short staffing, we have less funding than we need. So sometimes the practicality of just increasing funding is not quite as easy as it sounds. You know, if you have to go through a board of supervisors or through a city council or a governing board in order to have that additional spending approved, that could be very difficult, especially difficult when you're sitting in a state like California now. We're looking at a 50 or 60 or $70 billion budget deficit. Those resources are probably going to be very hard to come by. So if you're advocating to increase the revenue, the funding for the organization, think about practically how could that be done. If you can't do it through increasing appropriations, are there other avenues for increasing that funding? So be as practical, be as realistic as you can be with these 3 alternative solutions. You know, if one of your alternative solutions is, well, we need to triple the size of the organization's budget, obviously that's not going to happen. You're not going to get even close to that happening. So be as practical and realistic as you can be. Again, the paper is brief. I say no more than 10 pages. It should be as long as it needs to be, so I will defer to you on that. The only point here is to be as concise and succinct as you can possibly be in writing the paper. If you are using outside resources, do make sure to put those resources, those citations in APA 7th. For the background paper, I was not a stickler on that at all, and so I didn't knock off any points if your references were not in APA. But do try and kind of get them in the ballpark of APA 7th for the alternative solutions paper if you are using any external resources. The use of external resources will certainly depend upon the issue that you are talking about and the solutions that you are generating. And as always, make sure to proofread the paper. I won't line edit it, but I will read every word of the paper. And so I sometimes can't help myself. And so if there are some typographical or grammatical errors, I may make note of those in the paper, but I won't deduct a whole lot of points for it. But do make sure that you proofread the paper. And it looks like a graduate level professional type of assignment. So that is the alternative solutions paper. Any other questions about the alternative solutions paper since we're talking about it here tonight? Okay. As you work on it over the next 2 weeks, if you have any questions, always feel free to reach out, send me an email, and I'm more than happy to answer any questions that you may have. So just as a recap, Canvas essay number 3 coming up, that's your next Canvas essay, and then the alternative solutions paper coming due then on the 29th. Yeah, Najee, go ahead.
Yes, I just want clarification on the number of responses that we're doing. Do we respond to one or two students?
You can just respond to one and get full credit. So as long as you're responding to one colleague, that's good enough to get full credit.
Okay, thank you.
Sure. Yeah, and you're always welcome to respond to as many people as you would like, but one will get you full credit. And I tend to, for the most part, if your Canvas essay is well written, your Canvas essay addresses the prompt, and your response to a colleague is professional and collegial, then chances are you'll get 100 out of 100. So I tend to give 100 out of 100 full credit on those Canvas essays as long as they're well written and they're on point. Yeah, there really isn't that's a good question, Christian. Is there a page minimum like there was on the previous assignment? No, there's no page minimum. I just put that 10-page maximum on there just kind of as a guideline for you. But no, the number of pages really doesn't matter. As long as the content is there, that's what I'm looking for. I'm much more interested in the quality as compared to the quantity. All right, let me stop this share and then get into what we are going to talk about tonight. Let me share out our slides. And if memory serves correct, at the end of last week's classes, we were talking about the internal and external environment and the impact that external and internal environments have on effectiveness. I think we had made it up to the point of we had covered all of our information and we were up to the point of doing our breakout groups, looking at internal and external environments. So tonight we'll start out with this breakout group. So for our breakout groups tonight, I'm asking each group to answer the question, what aspects of the external environment can impact effectiveness, maybe 2 or 3 aspects of an external environment that can have an impact upon effectiveness, and then maybe 2 or 3 aspects of the internal environment, the environment within the organization, that can also then have an impact upon effectiveness. So as I put you in your breakout groups for tonight, just the rules stay the same as the last time we did breakout groups. The group should come up with a spokesperson. We'll spend maybe about half an hour or so working on this in our groups. Then we'll reconvene as a class. We reconvene as a class, then we'll have the spokesperson from each one of the groups then share out what the group came up with. Any questions about that? Go ahead and start creating our breakout rooms. So let's see. I think last time we did 5 breakout rooms. So I think we'll do that again because we are a relatively large cohort. So let me just do automatic random assignment into the 5 different breakout groups. So looks like we've got about 8 people or so in each one of our groups, 7 to 8 people in each group. So I'll go ahead and open up the rooms. You have your assignment that you'll be doing as a group. We'll do about half an hour in the groups, reconvene as a class, share out, see what we came up with. Then we'll probably take a real quick break, and then we'll move into our topic for tonight, which is looking at the impact of organizational goals on the achievement of effectiveness. And that's what we'll do then in the second half of class. So I'm going to open up the rooms, and then you can go to your assigned room. Okay, the rooms are open. Okay, I think we are all back now. So let's see what each group came up with. So we'll start with group number or room number one. I guess that's Anthony, Cynthia, Fabiola, Joshua, Kurt, Maria, Valeria.
Yeah, hi. This is Valeria, everyone. So our group talked about first, I think as we were brainstorming, we found a lot of parallels between internal and external environment factors that impact effectiveness. I think based on the organizations that we all tend to work on, there's a huge correlation there. But just to kind of differentiate some and just start classifying some. So for internal environment, factors that impact effectiveness. We were talking about employee turnover, succession, and not replacing employees. We did talk about how change in management and leadership can sometimes trickle down as well. We were talking about factors pertaining to training and development. And lack of processes for improvement or a checks and balance of sort, and how that can affect team morale. The work-life balance of your staff can also be something that affects the effectiveness inside the organization. And of course, like management practices not being transparent, not receiving buy-in. Conversely, we also said a lot of these also are environmental factors that impact inside the organization as well. We talked about bureaucratic hierarchy. We talked about for a lot of us, our organizations are heavily impacted by politics, as seen through state and federal regulations. We were talking about how the economy, and depending on how the economy is doing, how that affects our roles with both employee and our clients' housing and having risk of homelessness or food scarcity, and again going back to the economy and how that can trickle in the workforce. One of the major things that we also discussed was all of our organizations were heavily impacted during the pandemic, so that was an external situation that impacted a lot of different aspects, and it definitely was felt within our organizations. And something more on a positive note is technologies. As technology tends to, really surpass a lot of capabilities outside of the workplace. To an extent, our organizations are expecting the workforce to be able to keep up, such as AI, for example, and how that may or may not replace the workforce or have higher demands on a workforce to be more skilled, for example. And yeah, if there's anything I missed, my teammates can definitely jump in, but we definitely saw a lot of parallels just in all of those and how conversely they can impact one another.
Great. Thank you, Valeria. Well, there's a lot of good information there, and I think that observation that these are not mutually exclusive, and that influences can both be external as well as internal. And the one that you mentioned in terms of reduction of workforce through attrition, that's a great example. That you have employee turnover, you have employees leaving from within the organization, and then you have your budget makers and you have those from outside the organization saying, well, we're not going to fund the filling of those empty positions, and we're going to reduce the size of the organization through attrition. And I think that's a really common way that we see a lot of those budget reductions take place. So great. Thank you, Valeria. Very well done. Okay, how about room number two?
Hi, everyone. I'll speak for room number two. As Valeria mentioned, we noticed a lot of social, economic, and political factors that were kind of reoccurring in our brainstorming for internal and external factors, and their impacts on the environment. For question number one, we discussed technological advancements. One of our group members works in a hospital, and he mentioned that a lot of patients were scheduling surgeries within their department because they had a surgeon who specialized in robotic surgery, and that was something that really drew them to that particular department and with that particular surgeon. And it really emphasized that we are in a new age of technology where organizations are forced to adapt in order to maintain their demand for services. We also talked about economic factors. We mentioned inflation, employment rates, and we discussed how if people were on unemployment or unemployed, then they won't be able to purchase and participate in economic goods or services. And then we also talked about the demand for services. Someone mentioned how Amazon has a really high demand for services, but physical brick and mortar stores aren't performing as well. And so organizations need to adapt or whatever to kind of catch up. And then for question number 2, for internal environments, we discussed leadership styles. We determined whether if leadership is either weak or strong, then it will lead to poor organizational performance or a good organizational performance. And we also mentioned a trickle-down effect on whether or not leadership is strong will have a direct result on the outcomes. We also mentioned the resources that organizations have available and how it's crucial to organizational performance, whether or not they have adequate funding, proper equipment, or good relationships with their stakeholders. We also mentioned ethical standards. We asked the question of whether everyone in the organization is behaving effectively. If someone is not behaving effectively, then it impacts the whole organization. We also mentioned organizational structure and the importance of hierarchy, and how it impacts communication horizontally or vertically. Someone mentioned that their department has open door policies, and it creates a positive environment where employees feel comfortable communicating. And then lastly, we mentioned employee motivation and how good morale and a positive work environment influences whether employees stay motivated and engaged in their work, thus having a direct and positive result on organizations achieving their objectives.
Excellent. Very well done. Thank you. And we'll spend week 6 of this class, we'll spend talking about motivation of employees. Week 7, we'll talk about leadership. And so we'll have weeks devoted just to those 2 internal environmental influences. And technology, I don't think we can really overemphasize the importance of technology and not just incorporating technology, but incorporating the appropriate technology and making sure the organization and its members know how to use that technology. And I think that's extremely important. And what's really frustrating is, as you've mentioned, in terms of economic trends, what's really frustrating for a lot of organizations, the influence of macroeconomic trends. Those macroeconomic trends, you don't have any control over within an organization, but those types of macroeconomic trends can have a big influence upon your funding, upon your ability to staff your organization, your ability to purchase the technology you need and get trained on the type of technology you need in order to do an effective job. And so a lot of these things are frustrating because they're beyond the control of the organization. But some of those internal factors like leadership and motivation are within the control of the organization. And we'll spend 2 weeks talking about each one of those. Very well done. Thank you very much. Excellent. Let's go with room number 3.
Hi, this is Janine, speaking for room 3. First off, I just want to say that it was a really interesting discussion, and we initially, the majority of us started talking about the impacts to effectiveness only from a negative perspective, because I think that's just a natural thing. But I do want to state that even though that was a lot of our focus, there are positive impacts to effectiveness as well. So I'll start off with the external. A lot of similarities here to the other groups. We had politics can affect the effectiveness, funding, technology, both in the positive and negative, where in the positive, it can make things more efficient. In the negative, if a group is being asked to adopt something and not being properly trained on it, that can certainly impact effectiveness. The economy, laws, and more specifically, potential new red tape created, new processes. It may impact it in the negative in the short term, but could be positive in the long term, depending on the red tape if it's for safety. The client and customer preferences, we see that as an external impact. And the workforce, as in what kind of available talent is out there? Is the workforce, are they properly trained for the type of work that is needed in the organization? Internally, we have organizational. again, in the positive and negative, employee knowledge and experiences. Again, going back to the workforce, if they're well trained or not, and leadership. Those are the top three, but a little bit more into kind of the HR impacts. Does the employee have access to training? Are they knowledgeable on their topic? Have they been given clear goals? And again, this I have structure on there again. And I think that is it. If anybody else from group 3 wants to add more to that, that's what I have. Thank you.
Great. Thank you, Janine. Very well done. And one of the point, and you made several great points. The one that I really like is the idea that it's not always negative. And I think I kind of fall prey to this as well. And I always look at it in a negative light. What are some of the negative impacts of the environment on the organization's effectiveness? But as you correctly point out, obviously the environment can also have some positive impacts as well as negative impacts. I think sometimes I fall into that pattern of looking too negatively at some of these impacts. And I think it's the employee training, the employee expertise, the employee knowledge variable is an important one. And when we are looking at from that HR perspective, as you're talking about, it's important for us to highlight to employees that the organization can help them see the path clear toward achieving their goals and their objectives. Now, there's this theory of path goal theory, and path goal theory says that you can motivate employees by showing them the path to that goal and making the path to that goal as accessible and as straight a path as possible. And if you remove barriers to their ability to achieve their goals, that's going to motivate employees and that's going to incentivize them to be more productive and to achieve higher levels of performance. And so I think that's also a very, very important point. But I love that idea that it can be positive as well. And sometimes we overlook the positive and focus too much on the negative impacts. Great. Excellent. Okay. How about room number 4?
Yep, I will represent room number 4. Such as the way of room 4 and 5, a lot of the things that we've identified have already been mentioned here today. So I'll just kind of run through the list really quickly. For external, we have the economy, political environment, social or cultural trends, stakeholders or consumers and their feedback, appropriations from the legislature or the governing body, and the resources available in the market. In terms of internal, we have the quality of our staff, the training programs, the ability of us for us to measure our goals, our organizational culture, the quality of our leadership, the succession planning and mentorship sort of programs, receiving employee feedback and implementing changes based on that feedback, the implementation or management of resources that we do have. So we've classified resources as both external and internal. And then accountability and development of standard policies. One thing that we identified in our breakout group was that it's a lot easier for us to list internal rather than external factors. And that's just a natural consequence of trying to be effective. We can't really affect or we can't really change anything in our external environment, but we can have a lot of control over what's going on in our internal environment. So if we're trying to focus on effectiveness, we're probably thinking more along the lines of what is within our grasp, what can we change?
Excellent. Okay, well done, Leslie. Now I agree with you. I agree with your group that we'll tend to focus more on the internal because we have more control over the internal. And also we have closer proximity to those internal influences as compared to those external influences outside the organization. So, and the point you made is another very important one. You made a lot of great points, but the point about measurement of goals, and that's something in the second half of class tonight we will talk about, and we will kind of challenge the proposition of whether or not public organizations have identifiable and measurable goals, and we'll have a discussion about just how measurable goals are in public organizations. So that's a really nice segue into the information we'll cover in the second half tonight. So well done. Thank you, Leslie, and thank you, room number 4. And last but not least, room number 5.
Hi, I'm Brittany. We're room number 5. And we talked about what goes on with DPSS. Basically, the external, we talked about political, which would be like the board of supervisors. There's also a director that you can contact, which is Jackie Contreras. And so like if there's an issue, if there was an issue with a customer and a customer had an issue or whatnot, they would have to call out to like the director, for instance, for something to get done if the issue wasn't done with maybe a supervisor or someone, someone within the department. Then there's partnerships, different partnerships that they have, which is the clinic service providers. They have, they also work with Covered California and local community clinics, but they deal with Medi-Cal, CalFresh, and CalWorks. So that is what they deal with, but the external would be the clinics and the different health options, excuse me. And then the customers, like that's their big breadwinner, the customers. So with the demographics, I also thought about that. The demographics, that plays a big part in the external. And with the demographics, to me, I think it's really just the occupation of the person that's supplying and the income. Their income holds a lot of weight, and if they can get these services or not. The internal, we focused on the negative. So we talked about lack of training, inside they see this. A lot of people have become lazy. They were pretty much went back to how it started, or where they figured it started was back when COVID happened. A lot of people decided, yeah, I don't care anymore, or I'd rather work from home or whatnot. So the bad attitude and laziness has trickled on over the years. Also, low morale is another thing that's going on. And technological issues and system issues is also occurring. So if based off of what I can recall, just if they wanted to put something in the system, sometimes the system would reject it. I think that was how it was termed. I hope I didn't say it wrong, but basically the system needs some help. It's probably like an ancient system at this point. Is there anybody that wants to add in or maybe correct me when it comes to the technological issues? If not, that's group number 5.
Great. Thank you, Brittany. And yeah, I think we again can't emphasize COVID and how important COVID was as an influence. And I think that it was really challenging to our technological bandwidth in a lot of organizations, because we were ramping up technologically very quickly with virtual work and virtual customer service that we hadn't done before. I think that was incredibly challenging to organizations. And it's not uncommon to focus, as I said before, on the negative in terms of influences, especially internal influences. I think what's really interesting is when focusing on DPSS and focusing on the delivery of what are oftentimes eligibility-based programs, entitlement-based programs, I think the focus on demographics is very important. Because as the demographics shift, then you're going to have either more or fewer people who are eligible for these programs, placing different levels of demands upon the organization. With different administrations, they can then go and change the eligibility requirements, as you can do to an entitlement type of program. And if they change the eligibility requirements, they can make more people eligible or fewer people eligible, which will have a direct impact upon the organization, the demands placed upon the organization. And those are things that the organization really doesn't have direct control over. So that's something that's frustrating, because you have other decision makers who have control over those eligibility standards that are being established. So I think that's an interesting addition to our discussion, to think about this from the perspective of eligibility-based programs and the influence of demographics on the demands placed upon the organization. Great. Very well done. I know, thank you to all 5 of our groups. Thank you to all of our spokespersons. They did a very nice job. I know we are after 7 o'clock now, and so we could probably stand for a little bit of a break. So if it's okay, if we do about a 10-minute break tonight, because I do want to afford us enough time in the second half of class to talk about goals and mission statements and those impacts upon effectiveness. So take about 10 minutes. We'll say come back about 7:17 or so. and then we'll get into our discussion of goals and effectiveness. So have a good break. See you back in about 10 minutes. Okay, we are back from break, and so the remainder of our time together tonight we'll spend talking about goals and organizational effectiveness. I think we can do this in a pretty quick fashion because I know you have talked about organizational goals in other venues and other courses in the program. And one of the nice things about this course is that, as I said when we started 4 weeks ago, is that it almost has the feel of kind of being a capstone elective type of a course, in that it really pulls together a lot of the theories and a lot of the topics that you discuss in other courses and puts them within the service of our ultimate goal of trying to make our organizations more effective. And so a lot of the material we present in this class is not new material. It's just thinking about it a little bit differently in terms of how can it contribute to or sometimes detract from the achievement of effectiveness. So I'm sure you're all familiar with organizational goals and some of the literature on organization goals. The literature does differentiate between different types of goals. You have what the literature refers to as official goals. These are your more long-term types of goals, the ones that are tied to your mission statement, the ones that will be highlighted within your strategic plan. These are, again, oftentimes longer term types of goals. These are goals that are more overarching. These are goals that will take more time and resources and effort for us to try and accomplish as an organization. The nice thing about these official goals is that official goals really do add legitimacy to the organization, both for employees within the organization as well as stakeholders in the external environment outside of the organization. They really give us some good insight into the value of the organization. What does the organization value? What does the organization prioritize? And these official goals also will help to guide and motivate the behavior of our employees. The better we fashion these official goals, the more they will serve as a motivator for our employees, because our employees will know what they're trying to achieve and what they are doing on a daily basis, how that then contributes to the achievement of the overall official organizational goals. We know in addition to official goals, we then also have these things called operative goals. Operative goals are these more specific intermediate types of goals that we oftentimes achieve on our way to hopefully the achievement of the overarching official goal. And there's a theorist, you may have been introduced to this person before, but his name is Robert Ben. I'll put that in text chat. And Robert Ben talks about his theory of what he calls management by groping along. It's probably not the best terminology, but that's what he calls it, the management of by groping along, meaning that we tend to manage our organizations by trying to achieve these shorter term operative goals. And then hopefully if we achieve these shorter term operative goals, then the cumulative effect will then be able to achieve our long-term official goals. So the nice thing about these shorter term operative goals is that they give us kind of this sense of momentum that we're accomplishing goals along the way. The problem with having very difficult long-term official goals is that sometimes they can be frustrating. That this is a goal that's going to require maybe 5 years or so to try and achieve. It's going to require all this time, all this energy, all these resources. Along the way, we're going to get frustrated unless we have these operative goals that we can accomplish as kind of landmarks, as kind of like lane markers or mile markers along the way toward the achievement of our overall long-term official goals. So when we're talking about the impact of goals on effectiveness, I think we need to really be careful about what types of goals we are talking about. Are they official long-term goals? Are these more intermediate, shorter-term operative types of goals that we are focusing on? The literature gives us a lot of information, a lot of very useful information about organizational goals, the good, the bad, and the ugly. And we have decades of research that we can rely upon in trying to understand the relationship between organizational goals and organizational effectiveness. The literature tells us that goals are expressions of the values of the organization, and they orient employees toward the organization's mission. Now, I do a lot of work for NASPA, the accrediting body for MPA programs. And one of the things that NASPA focuses on for accreditation is to make sure that everything the program does is somehow linked back to its mission. And so they have an entire standard. One of their 7 standards focuses on the mission of the program and the goals that are articulated in the strategic plan of the program, and how well those goals then reflect the mission of the program. And then everything the program does, recruiting students, whatever they do, all of those actions need to directly relate back to the achievement of a goal and have congruence with the mission statement of the program as well. We know that goals can be useful, most useful, if they are clear. So just having goals does not necessarily mean that you're making progress toward effectiveness. If you have unclear goals, if you have conflicting goals, it actually can detract from organizational effectiveness. So we need to really be very careful when we write these goals that they are very clear, that they are specific, that they are measurable, that they are achievable, that they are relevant, that they are time-based. We hope that when we write these goals, that we are writing what we refer to as SMART goals. The goals are SMART, they're specific, they're measurable, they're achievable, they're relevant, and they are time-based. So they are specific enough so that we know what we are trying to achieve with these goals. They are measurable in that we have developed measurable operational definitions of these goals and measurable indicators so that we know when those goals are being achieved. They need to be achievable. They need to be something that the organization can achieve in a period of time. They need to be relevant in that they need to be relevant to the mission and the purpose and the vision of the organization. The mission of the organization tells us who we are as an organization, our rationale for existing. Our vision is then what we want to be essentially when we grow up as an organization. So where do we see ourselves in terms of the future? So our vision could be that we want to be the premier MPA program in the Western United States. That is our vision of where we want to go. Our mission could be that we are providing the skills and the techniques necessary for effective leadership and management in organizations at the federal, state, and the local level, or something like that. That's who we are. That's what we do. What we want to be, where we want to go, then we'll talk more about the value statement of the organization. And yeah, as Maria points out, Smarty, when you add in inclusion and equity, and we're trying to add in diversity, inclusion, equity, and inclusion into everything that we do. And this is something that NASPA is doing as well, is that NASPA is looking at these SMART goals of programs and then asking the question, well, how are you promoting inclusivity? How are you promoting equity in trying to deliver your curriculum to your students? They have now added inclusiveness and equity into their requirements for mission statements, as well as the requirements for the goals that come out of the program's strategic planning process. So we know we want to develop these goals that are very clear, very achievable, and very measurable. And that's then what will enhance our efficiency, our productivity, and our overall effectiveness. But the literature also tells us that there's a negative side to organizational goals as well, and that goals suffer from a myriad of problems. Problems such as multiplicity of goals. We know we have multiple goals in our organization. A goal could sometimes just be one of an entire set of goals. When you have multiple goals in your organization, you have to think long and hard about how you prioritize those goals, and then making sure that those goals hopefully do not conflict with each other. When you have goals conflicting with each other, then obviously employees don't know which of those goals to try and pursue. We know that we have these long-term and these short-term goals. Sometimes long-term and short-term goals can actually conflict with each other as well. So we have to be very careful, the literature tells us, in being as clear as possible with our goals and not to have too many goals. The more goals we have, the more likely it is that we will have conflict between our goals. The basic assumption in the public sector when it comes to public organizational goals is that public organizations have goals that tend to be particularly vague and intangible as compared to those in the private sector. So our goals in public organizations tend to be much more vague, ambiguous, and intangible than the goals that we see used in the private sector. So my question to you is, if you accept this proposition, why are our public goals, why do they tend to be more ambiguous, more vague than what we tend to see in the private sector? What are some of the reasons for that ambiguity?
Be
I'll
because
share.
we're not, sorry.
No, go ahead, Jenny.
I mean, because the end goal is not just to make money. I mean, I think it's providing service for the most part.
Yeah, and we don't have that bottom line. It's we're more service oriented. We're more oriented toward achieving public interest and the benefit of public as opposed to making profits. And so that will make them a little bit more intangible. Obviously, if we're trying to focus on enhancing quality of life, then our outcomes as well as our indicators are going to be much more intangible and much more difficult for us to measure in the public sector. What else? Anyone else?
I think sometimes defining that goal, what they really want to accomplish, is oftentimes vague to the people that are creating these goals. They have to do something and then they write this statement, but they really don't really define what exactly the end objective is.
Absolutely. And I think you're absolutely right that there's a political imperative oftentimes in a political environment among elected officials to we need to do something about this. And so they'll end up passing legislation that will end up being very vague and ambiguous. They don't have clear direction in terms of what they want agencies to accomplish and how they want agencies to accomplish it. And so therefore they write these very vague pieces of legislation, enabling legislation, and then they leave it to the agencies to try and figure out the specific goals that they are trying to achieve. And when you think about in a legislative environment, when you're trying to pass a piece of legislation, the more specifics you put into that piece of legislation, the more likely you are going to have pushback and the more likely you're going to have people who are against that piece of legislation. So you try and keep it as vague and ambiguous as possible to get it through the legislation process. And so I think those vague mandates that we tend to receive from elected officials, from legislative bodies, those vague mandates oftentimes lead to vague and ambiguous goals in our organizations. So the so what question then that we had on the previous slide is, not only why do we have vague goals, but what are the implications of these vague goals for things like employee motivation, employee commitment, and employee satisfaction? And the literature tells us very clearly that the more goal ambiguity there is, the more difficult it is to motivate our employees because our employees don't know what they are trying to achieve. Goal ambiguity also makes it very difficult for us to measure our performance. So at the end of the day, we are trying to enhance the effectiveness of our organization. If we're trying to enhance the effectiveness of our organization, we need to be able to measure what we mean by effectiveness and how well we are performing. If we have very vague goals, it's going to be difficult for us to come up with those specific indicators of performance. And lacking those specific indicators of performance, it's going to make it difficult for us to hold people accountable for their actions and to develop effective performance evaluation systems. And so I think when we look at all the problems that we have in evaluating the performance of employees within our organizations, some of those problems can be traced directly back to a lack of goal clarity and too much goal ambiguity. Now, admittedly, there are other reasons why our performance evaluation processes tend to fail. Employees don't like to have their performance evaluated because they fear cognitive dissonance. They fear that they're going to get a negative performance evaluation. We know supervisors try and avoid performance evaluation because they fear playing God. They know that the ramifications of a negative performance evaluation could be very negative, very important for those employees who are getting that negative evaluation. So there are lots of reasons why performance evaluation tends to be difficult, but I think it's next to impossible if we don't have clear and direct and measurable goals. So goals are important for us in our discussion of effectiveness because, as we'll see next week, and we've already made mention of this throughout this course, there are different ways we can measure effectiveness. The most common way of measuring effectiveness is a model of effectiveness known as the goal attainment model. How much progress are we making? How well are we achieving our goals? So that's the way in which we're going to measure effectiveness. And that's how we're going to do it right now. We'll change it up next week. But for right now, we're going to measure as how well the organization is achieving its goals. To what extent then, let me move some stuff around here. To what extent then does an organization achieve its goals? How can we go about measuring goal achievement in an organization? If we are going to assume that we're going to use a goal attainment model for effectiveness, then we are also assuming that our public organizations have goals to begin with. We're also assuming that those goals in those public organizations are articulated, that they can be discovered, people can find out what those goals are. We also have to assume that those goals in our organizations are at least somewhat stable in nature. We also have to assume that any abstract goals are capable of being converted into specific objective measurements, and that we can then collect data relative to those measurements, process that data, apply that data, and draw conclusions in a timely and appropriate manner. That's the assumption. If we're going to believe in a goal attainment model and use a goal attainment model, we need to fulfill these types of requirements. Organizations have to have goals discovered, goals need to be somewhat stable, goals need to be able to be converted into specific objective measures, and then we were able to collect data relevant to those specific measures, analyze that data, and then use that data to draw conclusions about our effectiveness in a timely and appropriate manner. My question to you, based upon your experience working in public organizations, is this true? Does your organization exhibit these types of characteristics that would allow your organization to then use a goal attainment model? So is it true? Does your organization have these different characteristics with their goals? Leslie, go ahead.
Yeah, there are some people, I'll just say, in an organization I've worked in, there are some people who did not want to measure our goals. I think they knew that we weren't hitting the goals, and therefore they did not want to measure them. They had various reasons. I mean, other than I don't think the reason necessarily was we would look bad on paper. It was more like we didn't want retaliation against individual employees. We wanted it to be more anonymized, to look at, the trends of our overall department, and not necessarily this one person didn't meet this one, is less productive than somebody else or something like that. So, but that one organization that I'm thinking of, that was a huge disconnect between, upper management and middle management about, well, you gave me this goal, but I'm not going to measure it.
Yeah. Yeah, we do want to avoid that gotcha game. We don't want to, put it at the individual level and say, well, it's this individual's fault that these goals are not being achieved. And I think that's an important point, is that it's something that we've kind of left out in our discussion here, and that is whether or not organizations even want to measure their goals. They may have goals. Goals may be discoverable. They may be measurable, but if an organization does not want to measure those goals and does not want to see how well they're achieving their goals, and instead they want to, kind of put their head in the sand and not want to do this, obviously it's not going to work, and you're not going to be able to use a goal attainment model. So I think that's a really important contribution discussion, how much does the organization want to actually go out there and measure its goals? So I think that's a great contribution. Anybody else? And again, you don't have to identify your organization, but just kind of from your experience, have you worked in organizations that fit these criteria?
I'm going to make a comment. I think there are many good intentions in the organizations, especially when the organizations have a regulatory mandate that these goals that they outlined on their strategic plan or a correction plan or something be measurable, right? And they collect data and stuff like that so that informed decisions can be made. But the perspective is more of a compliance perspective than a perspective of process improvement. Let's improve the processes. And it always falls back on resources. Do we have the resources? It would be great to measure this, but do we have the resources to be able to implement this measurement, right? And so oftentimes those good intentions just fall because they don't have the capacity to really do those true process improvements.
Right. Yeah, I agree with that. Resources are very important for doing this type of measurement of goals, and this is the same type of problem that affects things like program evaluation, policy analysis, in that we oftentimes lack the resources to be able to do these types of evaluations, and sometimes there's not the bang for the buck. There's not the political payoff for putting resources behind doing this type of an evaluation. And so oftentimes we may have great intentions, but we don't have the resources to do it. Another important point that you made is the idea of doing it for compliance. And so when we are required to do it, we're doing it for compliance. That's a much different situation than if we are voluntarily doing it for the purpose of program improvement and process improvement. For doing it voluntarily for program improvement and process improvement, we probably have much more of a motivation to be honest about our evaluations. If we're doing it for compliance, maybe there's not quite as much of a imperative placed upon being honest and being complete, but it's rather just checking that box off for compliance. Christian, go ahead.
I just wanted to say, I know some public organizations focus their goals around like the grants that they apply for. I know that they have to meet certain metrics in order for them to get approved or, or to be valid candidates or contenders, or contenders for these grants. So I know that there's certain metrics they have to meet, like, so that they could prove that they're, doing something in order to get these grants. So that could be, I guess, an answer to this question.
Sure. Absolutely, yeah, because you're required to do this in order to keep that grant money and to keep that grant money flowing in. And when I was on the school board, where I was on at the very tail end of No Child Left Behind, and so we had these requirements for doing these types of evaluations and documenting how we're achieving the goals from that piece of federal legislation. And if we did not, then if we could not show we were achieving those goals, then there would be a reduction in funding. And so there are some punitive measures that are associated with not achieving your goals. And so I think that's true for grant funding. I think that's true in some instances for appropriations as well. Anyone else? I think if we're answering the question, is all of this true? I think it is true that organizations do have goals. We spend a lot of time developing goals. We have spend a lot of time going through a strategic planning process. I think that once we put these goals together through strategic planning, I think that they can be discovered. I think we go out there and we tell people, here are the goals that we are trying to achieve. For NASPA accreditation, you have to list, here are the goals that we developed in our strategic planning process. And here are all the stakeholders who were involved, and here's how their involvement was ensured. And you talk about that because that's something you're required to discuss. So yeah, I think people are able to discover what our goals are as an organization. In terms of stability, I think a lot of that's going to depend upon the environment in which we are operating. If we're in a very stable environment, then our goals tend to be relatively stable. If we're in a very dynamic environment and we're very resource dependent upon that dynamic environment, that's when we get a little instability in our goals, and that's when our goals tend to change. I think where we struggle is in terms of taking abstract goals and converting them into these specific objective measures. I think that is incredibly difficult to do in a lot of our public organizations as compared to doing it in private organizations. Collecting the data, we generate a lot of data in our organizations, but collecting and analyzing, applying that data, that's going to require, as we talked about before, resources. And oftentimes we don't have the resources devoted in order to do that, and especially not to do that in a timely and appropriate manner. So I think generally this is true for our public organizations, but I think we do kind of struggle with clarifying our goals and coming up with those measurable operational definitions of what our goals actually mean. But as several people have mentioned, as we develop these goals tend to be developed through a strategic planning process. And I think most of us, if not all of us, have lived through a strategic planning process in the past. There are different ways in which we can approach strategic planning, but our goals flow directly out, typically, of this strategic planning type of a process. So even though different strategic planning processes will look different depending upon organizations, the basic steps that we tend to go through in strategic planning, number one, conducting an internal and external assessment. Conducting an assessment of our internal environment and an assessment of our external environment. And you've probably in your organizations done things like SWOT or SWOC analyses. It's kind of a dated approach, but something that's still used by a lot of public organizations. Identify your strengths, your weaknesses, your opportunities, and your challenges or threats, depending on whether you like SWOC or whether you like SWOT. In terms of SWOT and SWOC, there are some definite disadvantages, and there are some definite pitfalls we want to avoid when we're doing a SWOT analysis. What are some of the problems with a SWOT analysis for those of you who have gone through it before? Anybody gone through a SWOT analysis? I think in my experience with a SWOT analysis, one of the major problems is honesty. Organizations being honest with themselves about what the true strengths are, what the true weaknesses are, what the true opportunities are, what the true threats are. I think we have to be honest in this assessment, and sometimes organizations will downplay some of the threats and some of the challenges in the environment, and they will also then downplay some of the weaknesses, and then overemphasize and make their strengths look too good. And so I think honesty is really important as we're doing this type of SWOT or SWOC analysis. Maria asked if there's a book to recommend on establishing metrics for abstract goals. Yeah, I can certainly look into that. I can certainly get you an example. I think that Don Kettle has done a whole lot of good work on goals. Stephen Gold, may he rest in peace, has also done a lot of good work in goal attainment, but I will get you an actual title and share that in our Canvas site. Cynthia asked, would internal bias be an issue? Absolutely. And I think there's a lot of internal bias when you do this type of an assessment that you have to at least identify, because you have to be as honest as you can about what your strengths and weaknesses are as an organization. But flowing out of that SWOT or that SWOC analysis, that type of internal and external assessment will give you a sense of the strengths and weaknesses of the organization. And then you can use that information for developing your agency mission statement. Has anyone participated in the development of a mission statement before in their organizations? Anyone have an experience to share in terms of mission development?
We went through a strategic planning in my department relatively recently, last 2 or 3 years. And I wasn't there for the very beginning of it, but I did get to participate in the latter half of it. But one of the things that was kind of a barrier to our strategic planning, and it was both a positive and a negative, because we involved literally everybody in our department could participate in strategic planning, and they could, voice their opinions and their priorities. And we obviously did it in, smaller groups, and our consultant met with each division in our department, and everybody was invited to those meetings. And so that's great because everybody got to feel like they were involved in the strategic planning. But it kind of turned into like therapy sessions each week with our consultant, where we got off topic a lot, and at the end of every session, I just like apologized to our consultant because I was like, well, this was a really great session. I'm sorry that we didn't come up with the 5 visions that, you wanted us to come up with, but we did get a lot out of it. So.
Yeah, I've experienced that as well. And in my college a few years ago, our dean decided that, she went to go through the strategic planning process. And so she put together, she spent $250,000, $250,000 on a consultant to take us through a strategic planning process. And at the end of the day, we didn't come up with a strategic plan that was any better or any more useful than the one that we did as department chairs previously. And so it's kind of a waste of $250,000, but that's another story. But I think you're right. We want to include as many stakeholders as possible, but there's a negative side to that. The more stakeholders you include, the muddier the process becomes, the more difficult it then becomes to develop your mission statement when you have all these stakeholders involved. So I think what you need to think about with your stakeholders is organizations need to think about their primary stakeholders, their secondary stakeholders, their tertiary stakeholders, and then find ways in which those different stakeholder groups can participate based upon if they're considered primary or secondary or tertiary stakeholders. Because if you have everyone just thrown into the pot, if you will, and stir it up, it's not going to get done. And the old adage with strategic planning is if you're always planning, you're never actually doing. And so it just takes us a long time to put this plan together. But once it's together, we then have to actually go out there and try and implement it. So I think that's a great point in terms of there are advantages and disadvantages to including a lot of stakeholders in the process of coming up with your agency's mission statement. Mission statements are usually relatively stable, but can be revisited frequently. In my program, we revisit it each year, but we do not make changes to it necessarily every year. You don't want to be changing your mission statement each and every year because then it becomes very unstable, and then people really can't have a whole lot of buy-in into that agency mission statement. But your mission statement is, this is who we are, this is what we are all about, this is what we do, this is kind of why we are existing, and that's your mission statement. Your vision statement, as we said before, is kind of where you want to go as an organization and where the vision of where you see yourself. If things go right, you achieve your goals, this is where you see yourself in the future as an organization. So in strategic planning, you also want to try and articulate and communicate a vision statement. The mission statement obviously is going to be more actionable than your vision statement. Your vision statement is kind of aspirational, more aspirational than perhaps your mission statement. But then flowing out of that mission statement is where you establish your goals and your objectives as an organization. This is where you want to come up with our clear goals, come up with our measurable, and come up with our achievable goals as an organization. But when you develop these goals, you also have to take into account, are these long-term goals, are these short-term goals? Do we consider this an official goal? Do we consider this an intermediate operative goal as we develop these goals? These goals need to be measurable. So obviously we have to identify measurements for knowing how well we have progressed toward the achievement of those goals. And this is really where the rubber meets the road for most organizations. This is what's difficult in the public sector, is to come up with those identifiable and measurable indicators of those goals that we are creating. If you're in the private sector, it may be much easier. In the private sector, your number one goal may be your profit margin. And so that's a really easy quantitative empirical thing to try and measure. In the public sector, things like quality of life, much more difficult for us to come up with those types of measurements. Once we have come up with measurements that we can agree upon, we have to communicate those measures to our entire organization and then put together our action plans for how we are going to go out there and measure these indicators of our goals. Now, in putting together these action plans, it's important that we assign tasks so that we have people who are responsible for different parts of these action plans. If you do not assign responsibility to people in terms of carrying out these action plans will never truly be carried out. You can do a wonderful retreat like we always used to do in fall. We would go up to Lake Arrowhead, have a retreat of deans and associate deans and department chairs, do all this planning, put together goals, put together our indicators, our measurements. Then everybody would come back to campus and then life would intervene and nothing would ever happen in terms of these action plans. A year passes by, nothing's been accomplished, and then we're back at Lake Arrowhead, strategic planning again. And it's just if you're not putting these action plans into place, then you're just always planning and you're never actually doing. As many people have mentioned already, identifying these measurements and then measuring these indicators will require resources. And so we need to identify sources where we can get the revenue that we need in order to do this type of measurement of goals. As we said before, unfortunately, strategic planning, the measurement of goals, those types of evaluations oftentimes don't have the bang for the buck that spending money on other expenditures would. And so sometimes people look at the opportunity costs, that if we're devoting our resources to the measurement of these goals, these are resources that could be devoted to serving our citizens and serving our clients, because there are always opportunity costs when you're talking about public resources. Soliciting feedback on these goals and on this strategic plan from all of your stakeholders is important. Rolling that feedback then up into this strategic plan, submitting the plan to the agency director review and approval, and then planning implementation and a tracking system so that we can track for each one of these goals, who is responsible for doing this type of measurement, what's the timetable for when these measurements need to be done, so that we actually have that action plan in place so that we can truly measure our goals. So the goal attainment approach to organizational effectiveness oftentimes seems to be the simplest approach. How well is the organization achieving its goals? But as we can see from this discussion of strategic planning and the creation of goals, it's not that simple. There are a lot of moving parts in the goal attainment approach to measuring effectiveness. Sometimes if we do not have clear enough goals, then we're not going to be able to use the goal attainment approach. We haven't truly identified our goals or indicators of those goals. So therefore, we're not going to be able to define effectiveness through goal attainment. And we're going to have to then use one of those other models of organizational effectiveness, such as a systems resource model, a participant satisfaction model, or an internal process model in order to define and measure effectiveness. Those additional three models, the systems resource, participant satisfaction, and internal process, are models that we will discuss next week. And we'll talk about the similarities and differences between all those four models of organizational effectiveness, when you may want to use one model versus another model for measuring the achievement of effectiveness in an organization. So this kind of segues then into a discussion of those models of organizational effectiveness then for next week. Obviously, we're not going to do another breakout group assignment because it's 7:55 and we can't do that in 5 minutes. So we'll kind of leave it there with our discussion of goals. But I think that covering this quickly tonight is fine, because I know you've covered goals before. I know you talked about strategic planning before in the program. But where this fits is in terms of how we measure our effectiveness, how we identify whether or not we're being effective. In this perspective, it's how well are we achieving these goals. But to use that goal attainment approach for effectiveness, you need to have a strategic planning process in place where you have clearly articulated your goals. Those goals are directly connected to your mission of your organization. And you've also identified measurable indicators of those goals so that you can collect that empirical information to measure how well you're achieving goals as an organization. If you don't have those pieces in place, it's going to be very difficult for you to measure effectiveness through a goal attainment type of model. And then you'll have to use one of those models that we are going to talk about in class then next week. I know I went through the information very quickly, but again, that's just kind of one piece of the pie in terms of measuring the effectiveness of our organization. Some organizations do a good job with identifying goals, can use a goal attainment approach. Those that do not do a good job of identifying those goals, those organizations are probably going to have to look elsewhere for measuring their effectiveness as an organization. In our last few minutes together tonight, do you have any questions or any observations on any of this information we've covered in terms of goals and strategic planning? I know we covered it very, very quickly, but any questions or observations on any of this information? Then, well, like I said, next week we'll get into additional models of organizational effectiveness. We'll start class with that discussion of those 4 different models. Then we'll do a breakout group assignment where you can think about from your organization's perspective, which of those 4 organizational effectiveness models your organization uses. So that's what we'll do next week. Then the following week, we'll get into a discussion of motivation strategies and the impact that motivation has upon organizational effectiveness. And then in week 7, we'll talk about the impact of leadership and what leadership then means for organizational effectiveness. And that will probably wrap up the majority of the information that we cover in this class. And then hopefully for our final week, we can just reserve that time for you to finish up your final assignments. Maria, go ahead.
Yeah, this thought came to me, because I have seen like different templates of strategic plans. Is there like a best practice strategic plan that we should like have that covers all these different areas?
Yeah, I think that these steps here, these 12 steps are kind of the accepted steps in terms of kind of the best practices in doing strategic planning. Different organizations do it differently. Some organizations have a strong history of strategic planning. NASA at the federal level is oftentimes recognized as having a very good, strong strategic planning process. A lot of that fueled by some of the instances that's happened in the past with NASA, but the federal level, NASA is usually seen as kind of being that gold standard in strategic planning. I think actually on their website, they have a section, or they used to, on their strategic planning process and kind of walking through all the steps that they go through in strategic planning. I hope it's still there. It used to be.
Thank you.
Okay, well, I see it is 8 o'clock, so we should probably call the night because we've been at for 2 hours here. In response to Maria's question, I will get a couple of good sources and provide those sources then on our Canvas site in terms of books to give you a little bit of additional information on some of the material. So I look forward to reading Canvas essay number 3, and then if you have any questions as you are working on your alternative solutions paper, feel free to reach out to me. I'm happy to answer any of those questions. Okay. All right. Thank you. Have a great night. Have a great remainder of your week, and I will talk to you then next week. Take care.
You too. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you.